Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Junkyard Dawgcast. I'm your host, Jordan Hill. Got the whole crew with us, Kipp Adams and Ben Wolk, on this Thursday afternoon as we continue grinding through fall camp. The Georgia Bulldogs are continuing to work as we close in on the start of the 2024 season. We're going to open this episode by talking a little bit about some fall camp intel, some of the things we've learned in the last few days, definitely since we recorded on Tuesday. Also let Ben talk a little bit about his experience at some high school games on Wednesday night. And then we're going to really focus on the biggest part of this episode, which is going to be some stat over-unders for Georgia. I believe we did this last year, looking at different positions, setting some over-unders with the season stats, some of the players we think are going to stand out, and some of the guys we're going to be watching really closely. Ben, before we get into the full details from it, high school football's back, man. How was just the experience of being back at a game?
Yeah, I mean, we say football's back like 15 different times throughout this fall prep for the first weekend of college football period. And I feel like I don't know what stage high school football officially kicking off in Georgia is on that, but we're there and it felt good to be back out there. The fact that the first, to my knowledge, high school football game really anywhere that was happening was yesterday afternoon, and it was a Georgia commit that was playing in the game. Not only a Georgia commit, the most recent Georgia commit, made it very timely for me to be out there. And it just, like I said, it felt good. I got some concessions. I watched 2 football games. It was really nice being back out on the Friday night lights on a Wednesday night.
I have to ask, what'd you go with from the concession stand?
That's a personal question because of how many stops I made at the concession stand over the course of the night.
Fair enough. Well, we'll talk briefly about some stuff from fall camp. Honestly, and not much has changed since we recorded on Tuesday. We'll get a chance to talk to Ernest Green and Chaz Chambliss later Thursday night. Planning on having some content out of that on Friday. Probably the biggest thing that we're kind of watching right now is Roderick Robinson. I think on Tuesday I mentioned he was dealing with a toe injury. He was spotted with a walking boot. We'll have to see how serious this is. Kirby didn't really make it sound like it was something serious, but as usual, when a coach tells you something, you kind of have to dissect and say, okay, is him downplaying this, being legitimate to what the situation is, or is he just trying not to get a lot of attention on that? But that's going to be something that we're going to be watching. Definitely going to try to hear out of the scrimmage on Saturday if Roderick's able to go, because he was able to make plays in that first scrimmage. And really, other than that, I would just point to a story I did on Wednesday, just with everything that we've sort of learned to this point. And we kind of got into this on the last episode, but the biggest things to me, Dan Jackson deserves a lot of credit for what he's done so far. They're still, they're watching to see some guys break out in the secondary, and Kirby talked about that. And I wrote about that on Thursday as well. They need some guys to step up. And when you got a guy as experienced as Dan Jackson, talking about a super senior, I mean, I think that's big. And then the other thing I would point out that I'd mention was Christian Miller, who I don't want to pat Kipp on the back, but I'm pretty sure Christian was one of his picks in the fall camp breakouts. And seems like Christian's done a good job. And I think without having him or really anyone else break out, that they would have reason to be really worried about this defensive line. But it seems like Christian's coming along and that things are going pretty well. I do want to circle back on the Roderick Robinson situation. We've talked a lot about running back and the excitement that's coming with what they've been able to do. Kipp, does that give you any pause, just trying to figure out what is up with Roderick Robinson? Does that give you any concerns just about this running back room as a whole?
Having taken Roderick in my breakout players draft, it gives me a lot of pause. I am really worried about that, simply because, and I don't mean this to be a negative overall for Georgia, but going into, there's a possibility that he's not able to play against Clemson. And there's a strong possibility that, at this point, you could have Branson Robinson as your starter. He could be the one that, is out there when they first line up, which again, props to Ben on the steal of the draft, but also, just Branson and his recovery. But you can lather up a running back and get some momentum. And if he impresses, he might not give up that position. And I've been sitting here thinking about this all day, really, about this running back situation. And I do think Trevor Etienne plays against Clemson. I do think Trevor Etienne probably going to be, RB1 for this team this season. But if you ask me who was going to be second in this group as far as touches or rushing yards. I'm not sure that, I'd be able to give you a confident answer in that, because I think that, Nate Frazier is like getting more and more praise every single practice. Looks like he's going to be, a guy that plays serious snaps this season. Branson again coming along. When we actually see him play again, it's going to be huge for Georgia, but he's a guy that might be the most talented running back in the backfield. So I think that RB2 is now a huge mystery, which is a good thing for Georgia. This is not bad news, but Roderick's going to have more and more competition for touches the longer it takes for him to come back.
Yeah, it's definitely a question, and I feel like you can't really go wrong with one of the answers for running back 2 because you can justify pretty much those main guys in the mix. Ben, what do you think of this situation now that Roderick sounds like he's been in a walking boot, and we don't know the severity of the injury he's dealing with?
Well, I think that Kipp just told us that he spent all day thinking about this, when we know good and well he's been thinking about the Falcons way more than he's been thinking about Georgia's running back 2 situation. But aside from that, I agree with him that I think that Trevor Etienne is running back 1. And I think that the fact that you have this who is running back 2 situation is not a concern whatsoever. I think that this is a testament to the situation that Georgia's running back room is in, and the fact that Roderick Robinson can be dealing with a toe injury, and whether that's a very short-term thing or something that might last a few weeks into the season, I don't think hurts this Georgia room as much as I would have thought it had if we'd been having this conversation 3 or 4 months ago. And I think a big reason for that is Branson Robinson's health and what it currently looks like. I think that a big reason for that is the fact that Nate Frazier has made such a quick impression. And I do always like to pump the brakes on summer enrollee freshmen getting involved too early, just because there is so much that Georgia coaches probably don't trust him on yet, even if he has earned that trust, just because they have such a small sample size of what he's been able to work on it specifically in Athens. But based on everything we've heard, it sounds like he's had a great camp up to this point, which really doesn't surprise me, having gotten around him in San Antonio at the beginning of the year. Like, he seems like someone that's going to attack his business, and it sounds like Chauncey Bowens has certainly done that as well. So I think it's a good situation Georgia's in at running back, regardless of Roderick Robinson's health. That said, I think that he brings a dynamic to this running back room that nobody else has. And so I think that if Georgia's in short yardage situations this season, I think that they would prefer for Roderick Robinson to be that guy trying to get them those tough yards, because he's just going to make it happen a lot easier than everybody else is on sheer size alone. So his health is important, but I think that it's a situation that Georgia, I think, maybe not necessarily surprised themselves to be in, but I'm a little bit surprised that they're in, that the running back room feels as healthy as it is right now.
Definitely. And you look at Roderick Robinson, he looks like a bulldozer. So you want him out there, and I'm sure they're going to be really smart about working him back. So, Ben, we let off the podcast sort of previewing this, but you had a chance to go to some high school games on Wednesday. And sort of the focus for you was Jonte Gilbert, who, as you mentioned, Georgia's most recent commit, a 4-star corner. What did you see from Jonte being out there? And I know you got a chance to talk to him. What sort of stood out to you about what he had to say?
Well, it's funny because I know sort of the perception of Jonte Gilbert within Buttsmere and how he was viewed as a priority cornerback commit or prospect adjusted over time, and that camp that he had in May really made a big impression on Georgia. But it's funny, I saw him at his season opener last year when his Douglas team played Mays against Quintavious Johnson, who was committed to a Georgia commit at the time. And I remember watching him then and thinking, man, this is a long cornerback that moves well. And, he maybe traditionally height-wise and length-wise feels more like a safety than a corner. But when you watch him, nobody's testing him on that side of the field. And that was the case last year when they played Mays. That was the case yesterday when they were playing as well. And so I didn't notice a whole lot of difference. And I think that that's the thing with Jonte, is physically how he moves, how he covers, those types of things he's always been consistent with. That's never been the question. His film has never been the question. His measurements, at least size and weight, have never been the questions. I think that the question really was always straight line speed. And quite frankly, in a game like I was watching last night, they're not testing him on his side of the field. I'm not witnessing his straight line speed the way that I'm sure Georgia did when they had him running 40s on May 31st. And I think that is the big difference in terms of why Jonte Gilbert went from fringe Georgia target to someone that Kirby Smart was personally pushing for. And I wrote a little bit more about that at Dogs 24/7 earlier today as well. That's just, how Kirby Smart's hands-on role sort of altered the course of this recruitment. But all that to say, when we're looking at what I was able to watch yesterday, Jonte Gilbert was who Jonte Gilbert's always been to me as a player. I just think that his ability to verify some of that top-end speed stuff is what tipped the scales for him, because I think as a player, what he brings as a leader, I mean, he's one of the 3 team captains for his team, and that's been the case for 3 years now. He's going to bring all those things, and you're going to see that every single Friday night or Wednesday night or whenever Douglas plays their games, because it feels like they're always playing on weird days of the week. But ability-wise, I saw what I've come to expect from Jonte Gilbert. And I think, knowing that he went and ran a 4.5 at Georgia, and that was sort of the validation that Georgia needed to bring him into the class, that was really all the validation that I felt like I needed as well, just because I haven't seen many verified times on him lately. And so him being able to prove that, I think, was really the last little box that he needed to check.
Before we move on, was there anything else just that you got to see on Wednesday that stood out to you you'd like to pass along?
Yeah, I'll call out a couple of things. So another 2025 target, Rutgers commit, Chase Linton. He was playing in the second game of the Corky Kell yesterday at Kell High School. He was out with an injury. He wanted to battle through it. You actually saw him during pregame kind of, I don't want to say bickering it out, but sort of giving his stance on why he should get to play to parents and coaches and things like that. Ultimately, I think that the long-term health was the bigger priority. So he didn't end up playing, but it was my first chance to see him like in a football jersey, up close and personal like that. I'd actually seen him at a luncheon and he was wearing a suit, so I don't think it was possible to really tell, physically what he looked like. I kept saying that whole day, I was like, does he look like a Georgia Edge? Does he look like a Georgia Edge? Seeing him in his North Atlanta jersey yesterday, I mean, he is very built out. I'd say he's more traditionally outside linebacker than the other 2 guys that Georgia has in the class right now, Isaiah Gibson and Darren Etienne. Like, he's going to be slimmer than those guys. He's going to be more probably in the Damon Wilson ilk than the Quintavious Johnson or Gabe Harris ilk, which I think is more so what Isaiah Gibson and Darren Etienne are in this class. So I'll go see him again sometime later this year, but someone that Georgia is definitely going to take very seriously recruiting going forward. I think that it's one that could take until December, or at least until later in the season when he's able to get on some visits to Georgia, just because the Georgia side of things is relatively fresh minus the camps. I know it's way too far out to be talking about 2027 and 2028 recruits, but 2 guys that impressed me big time last night, Mookie Gibson, Quintarius Gibson, the running back from Kell High School. I think that he's a future star at running back. And then class of 2028 is true freshman class. So I feel like it's insane that we're talking about that. But at Douglas High School, there's a guy named Casey Barner. He's a defensive back, played a lot on the offensive side for them yesterday as well. He already has a Georgia offer. And the fact that he's a freshman already has a Georgia offer. There's a few guys that we've covered in the last couple of years, KJ Bolden and Elijah Griffin come to mind, where it's when Georgia knows about you and you've been offered before the start of your freshman year, it's usually an indicator that you're going to be a super high profile recruitment for 3-4 years to come. That's going to be the case with Casey Barner. And I'll note, he started out last night. He was the Wildcat quarterback when they were running their red zone packages. And it showed me a lot that the very first play or the very first drive of Douglas's season, they put Casey Barner in at Wildcat quarterback. He was basically what they were using to score points, from the very first moment of his high school football career. And the fact that they're trusting a true freshman to be doing that. I keep saying true freshman, like there's not true, like there's redshirt freshmen in high school, but a freshman at Douglas, the fact they were trusting him to do that said a lot to me. And he's not someone that looks like a freshman. So Casey Barner is a name that everybody listening to this will end up following his recruitment in years to come.
Remember, Ben Wolk was where you heard it first, folks. That's definitely what you need to take away from that. So we'll take a quick break and come back and get into our over-unders for the 2024 season. All right, guys, let's get into some numbers. This was something I worked on Thursday afternoon, just looking at some of the past stats for some of Georgia's players. Now, some of these over-unders are for specific players, as you'll see here in a second when we start talking about Carson Beck. But a few other ones kind of left it open-ended for all of us to discuss. The leading receiver, the sack leader, each of us can say who we think that will be and look and see if we think those over-unders are going to hit. So we are going to start with Carson Beck, and the over-under I set for Carson on passing yards this year is 4,200 passing yards. And just for everyone listening, that would be a program record. That would be what Stetson Bennett threw in 2022. So that would be kind of the benchmark, I would say. Do you think that Carson Beck sets the program record for passing yards? I'm going to start with you, Ben. Over under 4,200 passing yards for Carson Beck this season.
I think it's a good number. So I think you might have a future in Vegas, Jordan. But I think a lot of it comes down to how far you think Georgia is going to go this year. Like how many games you think Georgia is going to play. Because I think if Georgia has a 17-game season, for instance, I think that he's getting to 4,200 yards. So I think that a lot of people might just say, oh, I think Georgia's going to have a 17-game season, 16-game season. I think these could get to 4,200 yards. I think that regardless of that, the running game that we just have talked a bunch about is going to have so much more of an impact this season than maybe it did in some of those Stetson Bennett seasons that I'm going to go slightly under for Carson Beck. I do acknowledge that if Georgia has a 16-game season, I don't see a world where this goes under. But and even though I might think that Georgia does have a 16-game season, when I play out in my head what I think the snares of the year are, I think that when it comes to Carson Beck specifically, I'm going to go with the just under 4,200. But I think he was 39-41 or something like that last season. I think he'll be somewhere in between what he threw for last season and 4,200.
Yeah, part of it, even coming up with a number, is sort of a calculus of how long you think this season is going to be. So, Kipp, which way are you going? Over under 4,200 passing yards for Beck?
I mean, this is a how many games Georgia plays prediction here. In the regular season, I think it'll be pretty tough. It's an interesting dynamic, though, because on one hand, you have the schedule that Georgia has this year is, it's no joke, which also means Carson Beck probably won't be sitting in the second half a lot. So for me, I take the over because they're going to need him to be what everyone thinks he can be, which is the top quarterback in college football. And it's interesting because I think only two quarterbacks threw for over 4,200 yards last year. I think you had Bo Nix just throwing, against Oregon's schedule last season. He was able just to put up video game numbers, and our guy, future Falcons Hall of Famer Michael Penix Jr. Threw like 550 passes last year for Washington. So I think those are the only two guys that I can think of that had that many. But those are the type of numbers that, Georgia might need from Carson Beck this year. And if they're playing 15, 16 games, I think he hits those numbers. We're assuming everyone on this list that we're doing today is healthy. Obviously, we're not predicting anything otherwise. So, I'm going to take the over because I do think that they're going to need Carson to make some big throws and more throws in the second half than Georgia's had the last three regular seasons, where they've kind of just marched through the regular season almost untested, and we've seen the numbers the quarterbacks have put up the last couple of years, and I think Carson takes it to another level and sets some new records this year.
Kipp took some of my biggest points. I'm going over on the 4,200. One, it's the schedule. I think the fact that they're going to be playing some tough games, and not only that, Carson won't be sitting in some of these games, but he may be needed to throw for some of those yards in the fourth quarter. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And two, I keep into account that this is going to be Carson's second season, that you would expect him to take another step forward. Mike Bobo spoke last week about feeling like he had made progress with his deep ball. So maybe that would help on the yardage front. So, yeah, I'm going over. I think also when you consider how long this season could be, I think that he's going to break Stetson's program record, and that we're talking about a really productive senior season from Carson Beck. So we're going to stay on the Carson Beck front and go over under 26 passing touchdowns. And just for reference, Carson threw 24 last year. So I'll start this one. I'm going to go slightly under. I'm thinking like 25 touchdowns this year. My biggest thing is that I think you're going to see a reemergence of this run game, and that you're going to see that they're able to score a little bit more often on the ground. That you're going to, especially in the red zone, that you can rely on those guys to maybe score a few more touchdowns than they did in 2023. You look at last season, 24 touchdowns, as I mentioned. That was the lowest passing touchdowns for a Georgia quarterback in a full season, not counting 2020, since Jake Fromm in 2019. So I think that Carson's going to throw his fair share of passing touchdowns, but I think it's going to come slightly under that 26 number. I'm going to say he falls under 26 passing touchdowns, and probably around the 25 mark. I'll throw it to you, Kipp. You going over or under 26 passing touchdowns? You muted.
I actually hate these numbers that you've set, because it's honestly, it's a push for me. I think he's going to hit the number. So just for the, conversation, I will say under, because one of my questions with this offense is, where are the yards after the catch going to come from? We are expecting Oscar Delp to kind of be that guy and step up in a big way, but I'm still not sure that that's going to mean he's going to be similar to, what Ladd McConkey or Brock Bowers did last season. And so I'm not sure, when they get in the red zone, he's going to have to really step up and be that alpha tight end target, that tight end room. They're going to have to lean on them a lot. But I still think in the end, Georgia's running backs are going to get the call when they get to the red zone. I just look at this passing game as being one that really excels between the 20, the 20s out there. And then in the red zone, he's going to have to lean on the ground game, especially going back to what we said before, the opponents Georgia's playing this season. When you get in those, the tighter box there, these defenses have less ground to cover. I think that they're going to be able to really match up better with Georgia's passing game in the red zone. And I just think Mike Bobo he's going to dial up the run game to really help them get in the end zone a lot more this season than in years past.
All right, Ben, which way you going? Over under 26 passing touchdowns by Carson Beck.
Well, now y'all have my brain in a pretzel, because y'all both went over on the yards and then under on the touchdowns, and I think I'm going under on the yards but over on the touchdowns, and I'm wondering if my brain's not thinking about this the right way. But my thought on it is he was just under last year. I think he had 6 games last season where he either had 0 or 1 touchdown thrown, which, not to say that can't happen again this season, but it just feels to me like the command that he's going to have of the offense. And while there are weapons that he doesn't have last year that he does, he also lost some very key weapons in the middle of last season that I think threw a wrench in the productivity that last season could have had when it came to passing touchdown numbers. So I lean over on the passing touchdowns. I also think, given the running backs, and, we've talked about a couple guys, Etienne, Roderick Robinson. I think that Nate Frazier is going to show this probably more than anyone, that they are weapons in the passing game as well. And I think getting some of that from the running game could help as well. If you get a couple of those passing touchdowns that go to those backs, I think that helps inflate the numbers a little bit. So I'm going to go over on passing touchdowns for Carson.
Ben mentioned Trevor Etienne. He's next up on this list. Over under 860 rushing yards for Trevor Etienne this season. And just for context for people listening, in his last season at Florida, he had 753 rushing yards. So we will start with Kipp on this one. Over under 860 rushing yards for Trevor Etienne this season.
I mean, he's going to have by far the best offensive line he's ever played with. Sorry, to the 3 or 4 Florida fans that happen to be listening, but this is why he came to Athens. And I think that you look at what he was able to do the last couple of years for Florida. I mean, basically averaged 6 yards a carry. That's impressive, because, they knew to key in on him, and he was still able to be highly productive. But, again, Georgia running backs, I mean, that's just, if you're averaging under 6, you're actually kind of underperforming for Georgia. So I think that given his explosiveness, given that Georgia's offensive line, I mean, some think it could be the best, that Kirby Smart's had. I think that he's going to make every single touch count. And so I think if he, let's just say conservatively, he gets 150 carries this season, that's 975 easy for me. I don't know if he crosses the 1,000-yard marker, but I think high 9 is well within reason. And then you add in, it's not part of this, but you add in the receiving, he's probably going to get as well. He could break 300 yards receiving. So we're looking at a 1,200 plus yards from scrimmage season for Trevor Etienne, which is, again, going to be huge for him. But I think in line with how explosive and talented he is and how, productive he can be in Georgia's offense.
Ben, which way you going? Over, under 860 rushing yards?
That was probably a situation where Kipp just talked me out of what my original pick was going to be, because I think I was flirting with that number. I thought that it was, again, great number. When Kipp said that he's pushing the 1,000, it makes it feel like it's such an easy over. I guess my hesitation has been everything that we've talked about. Like, I think, how many rushing yards does Georgia rush for as a unit this season? And then how much of that percentage is Etienne going to get? Like, I think that's my big question. Does he get, if he gets enough of that percentage, I think that Georgia is definitely going to have enough rushing yards this season to be able to have an 850, 900,000 yard rusher. So for that reason, I'm going to go over on Etienne. He is going to be running back 1. Honestly, something dictating my decision a little bit is probably Roderick Robinson's early season health. Like, if we knew for certain that Roderick Robinson and Branson Robinson were going to be fully healthy week 1, and maybe if Nate Frazier had been a spring enrollee, I'd be a little bit more confident. But I think that Trevor Etienne's probably going to be asked to do the lion's share of the workload early in the season. And for that, he's probably going to get off, I wouldn't be shocked if by the Alabama game, if he's already halfway there. And that would make it pretty easy for him to get to 850, I suppose.
I'm going over as well. I see him probably around the 900 mark. I think that Kipp said one of the biggest things to me is that he's going to be playing with the best offensive line he's ever had. So I think that's going to set up well. Ben made a really good point too. I mean, now we have a question about Roderick Robinson. How much of what Trevor's workload is going to be early on is going to be out of necessity. So I'm going to say he goes over. And we'll get into this conversation in a second with the leading receiver, but I kind of wonder in Georgia's world if we're done seeing 1,000-yard rushers, 1,000-yard receivers, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. You're kind of spreading it out, getting several different guys involved. So I'm going over with Trevor Etienne as well. Speaking of leading receiver, so this is kind of a two-part question. It's going to be, who do you think is Georgia's leading receiver this season? And will that leading receiver go over or under 900 receiving yards? I'm going to start with Ben. Who do you think is Georgia's leading receiver? And are they over or under 900 receiving yards this fall?
Well, I think that I don't know about you all, I feel like there's 3 people that are probably the most likely candidates for who the leading receiver would be. And I think that in some sense hurts anybody's chances to get over the 900 mark. I'm going to go just a shade under 900. I'm going to go with Colby Young being the leading receiver. I think that he's going to be a third down option that Carson Beck's going to fall in love with. I think that he's going to be a red zone option. And I know that probably doesn't help the yardage mark as much as the touchdown mark, but I just think that he's going to become Carson Beck's top target. And because of that, I think that he will be the leading receiver, but I think that he's going to be just a shade under 900 because potentially some guys that you end up naming, I think, also have a shot for that 900 mark as well.
Kipp, who is your leading receiver and over under 900 receiving yards for them this year?
Well, I've thought about this a lot, and really in the end, I'm still wondering, the one question mark still kind of in Carson Beck's repertoire is the deep ball. So, while Colby Young, that back shoulder fade, downfield guy who can win the 50-50 balls, it seems, to be a real strength. It's something he brings to the table that Georgia hasn't had. I have to see it. And, even on G-Day, you still saw that, they're trying to get that chemistry together, that connection together. So I'm not going to predict something that I really haven't seen yet. I think what he will do, along with the speed Georgia's added, in the position room, I think that he'll have more room to work with underneath. And so for me, I just think it's Dominic Lovett. I think that's the guy. When you look at someone who Carson Beck has the most trust in right now, knowing that, Oscar Delp and bringing in guys via the transfer portal that are really talented. These guys add a lot. He already knows what he has in Dominic Lovett. And so I think him having, 60, 65 catches for 700 yards, I think that's gonna make the most sense. We've talked about the depth in the pass catching room. That's also going to play a factor when they try to rotate these guys in. But I think in the end, Dominic's going to be the guy that whenever he knows he needs a first down, he knows he can get it there with Dominic.
I imagine when Ben was talking about 3 legitimate options, it was Colby Young, it was Dominic Lovett, and it was Dylan Bell. And even going back to early this offseason, I kind of bounced back and forth between if I thought it would be Dylan Bell or if I thought it'd be Dominic Lovett being the leading receiver. I'm going to agree with Kipp that I think it's Dominic Lovett. I think him in the slot. I thought that toward the end of last season, you could kind of tell he had gotten into a groove. I think he's carried that on to this offseason, getting ready for this season. So I'm going to pick Dominic Lovett. I'm also going to go under. I could see him getting around maybe the 840, 850-yard mark. Again, as I kind of mentioned a minute ago, I think that the days of, wanting another 1,000-yard receiver for Georgia, I just think those are over. I don't take that as a bad thing, though, because as Kipp pointed out, Georgia does such a good job of rotating in receivers. And I think, whatever starting 3 they put out there, if Arian Smith's not in it, you're going to see a lot of him. If London Humphreys isn't in it, you're still going to see a lot of him. I think that they're going to do a very good job of continuing to rotate guys in, but I feel really strongly about Dominic Lovett. I think he's going to have a big season, but he is going to fall short of the 900-yard mark. All right, guys, we're going to switch over to the defense. And with this one, I thought about leaving it open-ended, talking about tackle leaders, but I kind of thought this would be more interesting to pick a specific player. So we're looking at inside linebacker C.J. Allen. He's coming off of a pretty productive freshman year. I think he had about 41 tackles, stepped up really in November and December once Jamon got hurt. So C.J. Allen, over under 70 tackles. And I'm going to throw it to you, Kipp. Which way are you going with this one?
As long as CJ's in there, I mean, that's an easy over for me. I think the last 5 years in Kirby Smart's defense, you've had a linebacker with 70 or more tackles. And, Smile Munden's coming back from injury, should be fine. CJ Allen's, battling through camp as well. But again, we think he's good to go there as well. I think CJ Allen's ready for that breakout season. And I think he leads the team in tackles, whether that's 80, 85, somewhere in that range. How many games they play, sure. But I think he easily clears the 70 tackle mark and is on a lot of all-conference lists at the end of the season.
Ben, what do you think? 70 tackles over under for C.J. Allen?
Well, I think I was looking back at it. I think Georgia's had at least – I think last year was the first year since 2018 that Georgia didn't have a 70 or a linebacker with 70 tackles. I think there's been 1, maybe 2 years that Georgia had 2 linebackers that were 70 or higher. Again, I think this question probably comes down to, do you think Smile Munden or CJ Allen is Georgia's tackle leader this year? And Smile's gotten to that 70 number before, so we've seen him do it. We know that he can. He hasn't been fully healthy at all times for him to be able to do it every year, but I do lean towards CJ Allen leading the team in tackles this season, or at least among the linebackers. And so because of that, I will go over on 70 for CJ Allen. I think that he's someone that, because the buzz around him has become so familiar with, last year, fall camp, and then during the year at times, and then this past offseason, that this fall camp, there probably hasn't been as much CJ Allen buzz because people kind of know what they expect from him. But he's someone that I think is going to have a big time next year jump.
Ben took the words out of my mouth where it really is between him and Smile Munden. And I think when you still have the questions about Smile, I think he's going to be fine, and you're still going to see a lot of production out of him. But I'm going over. I think that CJ is going to have a really productive season, going over 70 tackles. I guess we'll try to revisit this at the end of the season. I'm going to say 77 tackles for CJ Allen. And Ben, you're the resident jersey number scientist. Would he hit that number if he had not moved to 3? I think that was maybe of all the jersey numbers we saw, the swaps that were made. I mean, that just looks right for Georgia to have an inside linebacker wearing number 3.
Well, he's definitely going to get to the ball faster this year. That much I know for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that just makes sense. Okay, we were talking about this before we started recording. Kind of a anomaly with Michael Williams' stat numbers. We're looking at tackles for loss. Over under is 6.5 tackles for loss, and that's because that's the number he's hit each of the last 2 seasons for the Bulldogs. So it's basically if you think that Michael Williams will be more productive for Georgia this go around than he was the last 2 seasons. So I'll just start this one. I'm going to go over. I do think that Georgia's going to be really smart about trying to maximize what they got in Michael Williams, because it's no secret that this is probably going to be Michael Williams' last season at Georgia, that he's going to have a chance to go play in the NFL, might be a top 10 pick, maybe in the contention for the number 1 pick. So I do think that he's going to get more opportunities to make plays coming off the edge. I'm going over 6.5 tackles for loss. I could see 7.5, 8. I think he's got a chance to be Georgia's leader as far as tackles for loss. He'll also be in the conversation for sacks as well. So, Ben, where are you going on this one? Over under 6.5 tackles for loss for Michael Williams?
Well, I want to pick 6.5, like on the number, just because I think doing that 3 years in a row would be one of the more weird statistical things that happen. But because I'm not a hater, I'm going to go over. I feel like you're asking me, do I want to be a Michael hater or not? And so I'm obviously not going to be a hater. I'm going to say that I think that he can improve by at least a half tackle for a loss over his first 2 years from having to choose go over or under. But all evidence supports the fact that he's probably going to have 6.5 tackles for a loss this season.
Hey, I'm never going to say anything bad about a Columbus, Georgia native. Shout out Hardaway High School. Love the Hawks. Would never, ever dream of going under. At least I wouldn't. So, Kipp, which way are you going? Over under 6.5 tackles for loss?
Easy over for me. No questions asked. I mean, I think 7 should have been where it's set at. I think this is, very conservative.
Taking shots at the line makers, I see.
I know this is the opposite. This is where you faltered here. If he doesn't hit this number, I'll say this: Georgia's in trouble. There's, you made that kind of position switch in the Orange Bowl. You're saying he's going to be more in the hybrid role. You're going to utilize him as your pass rusher to take more advantage of what he brings to the table, and he doesn't hit the numbers he's hit the last 2 years. That's not good. That would be a huge red flag to me. Again, assuming everyone's healthy, if this guy plays in 13 to 16 games and doesn't hit that number, you got to go back to the drawing board and see where you did Michael Williams wrong. Because we're talking about a guy that's going to be probably picked, let's just say top 10, top 15 in the draft come next April, and you don't want to have a guy up there throwing his stats up there that he had 5.5 tackles for loss this past season, and he's like the number 9 overall pick in the draft. That would be pretty brutal. I mean, again, Trevon Walker had 7 tackles for loss his last season at Georgia. Let's start and go from there.
Kipp kind of throwing shade at my line, said, "What's the quote about the man in the arena?" I might let Kipp do it next time we do this episode.
You did give us the ability to alter any line, so really Kipp's taking a shot at his own oversight of the odds making.
I'm going to go back and say it's been a very, very active 24 hours for the Falcons. I've been a little bit distracted, and I apologize to the listeners. I did you wrong by allowing that line to fall through the cracks. I'll do better next time.
Guys, I think this next one, to me, is maybe one of the more interesting ones, kind of the two-prong of who you think is going to lead the team in sacks. And then the over-under I said is that leader having 7 sacks. So since Kipp, really liked my lines, I'm going to throw it to him. Who do you think leads this team in sacks? And do they finish the year over under 7 this season?
Jalen Walker, 9 sacks. Just lock that in right now. This is it for him. He is ready to break out and have that, as I've said before, that James Cook style. We figured out how to use him correctly a season. Also, him learning more and more about how to play the linebacker position versus just being a pure edge is going to get him more snaps as the year goes on. And I mean, in these big games, he's going to be part of that havoc package. And yeah, I mean, Michael Williams out there with him, I think it's going to be huge for Georgia. And I just think he is going to be probably the most explosive playmaker for Georgia this season. I mean, we talk about the star position and how that, the last couple of seasons, that's kind of been that position where you're batting a lot of passes down, you're forcing turnovers, you're also sacking the quarterback. I think that Jalen Walker this year just gets completely unleashed and is up there in the conference as far as sack leaders when all is said and done.
I know Georgia fans would be super excited to see that if Jalen Walker was able to do that. Ben, who is your pick to lead this team in sacks, and do they finish over or under 7 on the season?
Well, I think if Jalen Walker has the year that Kipp just laid out right there, I think this Georgia defense is going to be a problem because I think generating some of that sack rush has been the biggest challenge that they've faced in recent years. And I think we talked about this before we got on the show, but I think Georgia faces a challenge of how they're game planned and how they're schemed makes it tough for individuals to rack up sack numbers because teams know that if they live that way, Georgia's just going to eat them alive. And so it doesn't allow that. Other teams just don't allow it to happen very often. I'm with Kipp on Jalen Walker when he said the other day at the press conference that the edge is his natural habitat, just the authority with which that he said that. I was like, this guy is going to wreak havoc this season. I am going to go under the 7 number, even though I hear what Kipp's saying. And if he's safely over that 7, I would not be surprised in the slightest because I do think he is Georgia's biggest problem maker when it comes to rushing the passer. And I think the fact that you can line him up in a bunch of different ways and teams don't necessarily know exactly where he's going to be attacking them from makes it that much more difficult. But again, I do sort of go back to teams just scheme their way out of getting sacks from Georgia. And I think that ultimately that's what makes Georgia's defense so threatening is because teams have to completely change the way that they think. And because of that, that can hurt your individual statistics, even though, when you're looking at the film, you're very, very productive.
Right. And I think, too, if you'll remember, probably the last 2 years, I know last year especially, Kirby gets a lot of questions about the pass rush, and he always emphasizes that sacks aren't the end-all, be-all, that they want to create havoc and that they don't put everything on sacks. I'm not going to pick Jalen Walker. I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm going to stick with Michael Williams kind of for the same reasons we said a few minutes ago. I think that they understand that they want to maximize his ability to get after the quarterback. So I'm going to say Michael Williams leads his team in sacks. I'm going to say he has 6, just short of that mark. But I will throw out another name that I think may be in the mix, and it's Damon Wilson. I think that Damon could be a guy that gets in the mix at outside linebacker, plays quite a bit. I don't know if he's ready to lead the team in sacks as a sophomore, but I think he's going to be a very effective pass rusher for Georgia this year. All right, another one that I would kind of pair up with sacks with what Ben was talking about. If you look at Georgia, for most of Kirby Smart's career, they don't really intercept a lot of passes. They don't, on the whole, usually cause a lot of turnovers. But what they usually do is force a lot of 3-and-outs and, stop drives before they really get going. So interception leader, I'll start with this one. I'm going to pick Dalen Everett, who that might surprise some people who are listening to this, but I think that Dalen, had his up and downs last season. I think he came out on the other side of that. I think he's had a great offseason, and that's continued into fall camp. The over-under is at 3.5 interceptions. I'm going to take a bold step and say he goes over with 4 interceptions. And I think a piece of that is the last few years, Georgia sort of had that one corner out there that every team knew, all right, we're not going to test Keely Ringo or we're not going to test Kamari Laster. And Dalen's got that tape out there, and he's coming back as a starter, so I could see teams maybe being a little hesitant about going his way. But I think that teams are going to test him because now he's the top cornerback, and I think he's ready to make a lot of plays. So I'm going to give it to Dalen as the interception leader this year. I say he gets 4 interceptions. He goes over 3.5 interceptions. That was the line I set. I'll throw it to you, Ben. Who is your interception leader? Do they go over under 3.5 interceptions this season?
I like that pick a lot. I think this is probably who I picked last season as well, but I'm going to go with Malachi Starks. I think part of his problem that he runs into is he's so good, and everybody knows that he's one of the best safeties in the country every time that they go into a game, that quarterbacks are very aware of 24 and they're not challenging him very much. And I think that he got challenged early because he was the freshman, and people realized real quickly you can't challenge him early or you're going to look really stupid. And so I think that he gets limited opportunities because of that. That said, he had 2 as a freshman. I think he had 3 as a sophomore. So I'm going to give him the over. I'm going to say he improves at least 1 year over year each of his 3 years at Georgia. I'll say my personal line that I'm setting for Malachi Starks is 7.5. And I know that sounds like a crazy number. How's he going to have 8? I know that Kirby Smart's made some comments in the past about his 13 career interceptions, and I know that microphone is going to have some commentary about that at times throughout the year. So that 7.5 number would be him tying Kirby Smart for the career interceptions record.
Yeah,
not record, but in the you guys get what I'm saying.
Oh yeah. All of a sudden, Malachi gets 6 against Tennessee Tech, and they're like, "Oh, okay, I understand why he was still out there for so long." But
Yeah, exactly.
I even think about last season he had 3, and he should have had 4. If y'all remember the Tennessee game, he had 1 dead to rights, and I think he might have just kind of lost it in the lights, and he was asked about it later. So to me, Malachi was a good pick there as well. Kipp, who leads this team in interceptions, and are you going over or under 3.5 interceptions for them this season?
I will say I am going to go under. I do think that having Malachi out there, that's the one player you're going to try to stay away from as much as you can, even though his range is just ridiculous. So I think it is going to kind of change things up a little bit. I think in the end, I'm looking at this as who are opponents going to try to test, who's going to have the most pass defenses in that scenario. And so basically it's who do I think is going to win the left cornerback battle. And so for me right now, I'm going to go with Daniel Harris. I think that as far as teams game planning right now, they're going to look and say, who do we not know, is going to do his job right now. We don't have that film out there yet. And I just think that Daniel Harris is going to be the guy that's going to have a lot of balls thrown at him throughout the regular season and going to have to prove himself as Georgia's likely CB2 winning that battle out of camp. And so it's a little bit of a projection right there for me. But I do think that, with his length and the ball skills that he has, I think he's going to be able to win a lot of 50-50 battles out there. And also knowing that Georgia's going to affect a lot of passes in the backfield, I think he's going to show off his leaping ability, his range, and his length. And, I do think that if I'm looking at the over-under, I think it's going to be an under, but I do think you're going to have, maybe a bunch of guys with 3. I'm just kind of picking him out, and I don't want to pick it like a 4-way tie at 3. So I'll say he has 3 and maybe 4 guys have 2 interceptions.
Let's give a shout out to Taki Smith for leading the team in interceptions last year. I just don't think we give enough credit for the season Taki had. He did an outstanding job. All right, we got a few of these left. We're going to turn to special teams because we got to give some love to the kickers and punters. Over under Peyton Woodring, 85% on his field goal attempts. He was 84% last year, no misses in a stretch of 9 games after kind of a shaky start. And then the SEC title game wound up missing a long one. So I'll start with this one. I'm going to go, that 85 line is a strong one. I'm going to go under just barely. I think he's going to have a good season. But again, he went 9 games last year without missing one. That is a really, really hard feat. I think he's going to have a good season. He's going to be a reliable kicker. I think 85 is just a little too high there. Kipp, where are you going? 85% on the field goal attempts for Peyton Woodring.
He really proved himself last season. Gosh, for most of the season, after the first couple of games, he locked in. I'll go back to the schedule and use the schedule as kind of a hedge there to know that some of these road games, I mean, it's going to be a little tough. And so I think you look at the last, I guess, 4 or 5 years. Our man J-Pod did pretty good just to get over 81. So I think an 82.5% for him would still be a solid season. And if we're counting the playoffs as well, we'll see how it goes. But I just think that 82.5 is a good mark for him, and I think he's going to be asked to do a lot. I mean, he's going to be some tough kicks he's probably going to have to make, especially if Georgia, kind of struggles a little bit in the red zone on the road.
All right, Ben, where are you going? Over under 85% for Peyton Woodring.
Well, Kipp's case about the road game element was very compelling. I got to say, the Texas, Alabama, Ole Miss road games, you got to think you're not going to go perfect in those environments if you get the opportunities to kick. So I do agree with that. That said, this guy is nails. I mean, I think that this is as good of a kicker as Georgia has had. And I don't want to set too high expectations for kickers because it's so easy for a last, final minute situation for things to go awry and just the sentiment around a kicker to change. But I mean, from just watching his pregame warmups where he stands on the sidelines and kicks at the goalpost, the second I watched him do that, I think it was week 3 last year. I think it was the South Carolina game because it started to rain a little bit. And I was just like, the fact that he's as nails at this as he is just blows my mind. I think that was still when he was struggling a little bit too. So I think that he's going to go over, and I think that he's got a chance to be one of Georgia's better kickers historically as well.
Yeah, and I'll eat crow with Peyton Woodring, where when he started off so rough last year that I was like, why are they not turning to Jared Zirkle? And credit to Kirby Smart and credit for that coaching staff because they knew that Peyton Woodring was capable of working through that, and he did. And I think he's a big reason why the special teams is as good of shape as it is going into this year. All right, turning to our favorite punter from down under, Brett Thorson, 45 yards per punt, over under. I'll start with you, Ben. Do you think Brett goes over under 45 yards per punt?
I'm going to go under. And there are a couple of the reasons why. I don't think it actually has anything to do with his potential or the potential of his leg. I think, one, Georgia tends to move the ball pretty well. So because of that, very rarely is Georgia in situations where they're punting and you've got 80 yards of green grass to work with. Secondly, Georgia has put such an emphasis on, and I don't know that it's an emphasis or just that Dom Lovett and Arian Smith are so good at what they do, but they have put a value on not allowing return yards in the punt game. And I think part of that has to do with hang time more than distance. And so I think because of that, there's probably been a little bit of an emphasis placed on let's increase hang time. Let's make sure that if they don't return a punt the entire season, you don't have to worry about a punt return touchdown for the entire year. And so I think that because of what they saw last year, there's probably a little, I don't know if it's a team goal or anything like that, but I'm sure that there is an element of trying to replicate that from a season ago. And I think just naturally, when you're taking that approach, you're not going to be booming 65 yarders because when you're doing that, chances are there's a more likely opportunity for a return.
Shout out Brett Thorson, who's wearing a Dwight Schrute shirt the other day, and they're like back to school photos they did. That was really cool. Kipp, where are you going with Brett Thorson, 45 yards over under punts?
I'm taking the under. Ben nailed it. I think he's going to be coffin cornering it all day. I mean, that's going to be the name of the game, getting that ball inside the 10, pinning them back as far as they can is, I mean, obviously more important to the Kirby Smart. If Brett goes out there and just, knocks one into the stands, I don't think he'll, that punter depth chart will be updated real quick. So he might only get to punt 35 times a year, which also is a ridiculous number. Just the fact that he's gone 27 games and only punted 68 times, not eligible for the national stats basically the last 2 years. And the fact not having one returned, I mean, we've ever figured out if that's even like been done before with that many punts? I'm not sure, but yeah, I don't think he hits the 45-yard mark. And I think, like Ben said, that's by design. And I think that's going to be a huge, honestly, weapon for Georgia to have in these close games.
Yeah, I'm going under as well. I mean, to the points y'all made. And I'll even say, that I think he might punt a little bit more this year than he has, again, because of the competition. And that might also kind of affect how high that average could be. But he's going to have another productive season. He's going to be a guy that, if he hit the numbers, would be in the mix for the Ray Guy Award. But no matter what, he's going to have another productive season. And I'm going to say it. I bet they don't allow another return. I think they do it 2 years in a row, having Dom Lovett and also having Arian Smith back for a second season. All right, now we are going to get into some season stats, looking at the Georgia offense and the Georgia defense. We're going to start with the offense, and the number is 38.5 offensive points per game. Now, just for context for people listening, Georgia was at 40.1 points per game a year ago. So I'm going to start with you, Kipp. Are you going over or under 38.5 points per game for this Georgia offense?
Easy over. I mean, this is it. This offense is going to have to be lights out in these games. And I think, again, they're going to have the starters out there a lot longer. They're going to be in some big, tough battles. I get it. They're playing some talented defenses as well. But I think you look at the offense the last 2 seasons, it clears that number. They've been over 40 points a game the last 2 years. And I just think that's what Georgia's offense, the expectation should be moving forward, regardless of who the opponent is. They should be able to, push 40 points every single week. So I just think they're going to need to score over 40 in some games. And I think they're going to be able to easily score over 40 in some games against some of the opponents, in between those marquee matchups this season.
Ben, it looked like you raised your eyebrows when Kipp went over there. So what's your call? Over under 38.5 points per game?
It surprised me that he thought it was an easy over situation, but I actually agree. I mean, I think that Georgia will go over the 38.5. What's the best ever? 41.3?
I think that's what it was, because they came just short of that.
I think that this is the year. I mean, I think that, we've talked a lot already in this episode about the potential that Carson Beck has, the potential that the running back room has, trio of wide receivers that could make an impact when it comes to the receiving stats. And I just think the more that we talk this through, the more this feels like an offense that is going to take a step from last year. I think that last year probably could have seen some more points scored had Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey not been as banged up as they were. I think that hindered last year's number from being able to get to that 41.3 mark. But I think that, health notwithstanding, I think that Georgia, I would expect them to get to 41.3 this year. And so because of that, I think that they'll go over 38.5.
Yeah, it's 41.3 from 2014, which was Mike Bobo's last year as the offensive coordinator the first time around. They got close to it, 41.1 in 2022, and then took a little bit of a step back this past season. I am going to go slightly under. I think it's right around 38.3, somewhere in there. Again, I just go to the competition. I go to who they're getting ready to play. I think this offense is going to be good. I can see people being like, what are you talking about? 38 points a game. You will gladly take that. You will take that. You can win plenty of ball games scoring that many points. So I'm going to go slightly under, but I'm not worried about this offense. I think it's going to score plenty of points. I think they're in good position to, as I think all of us expect, be in the mix once it comes playoff time.
Those are 2021 numbers you're asking right there. That's what you're saying is that you expect this offense to put up 2021 numbers. So, leading into that next one, I'm looking forward to seeing what you think about this 2024 defense, if it's going to match up with what they did in 2021.
So let's look at it. The defense, I have the over-under at 17.0 points allowed per game. Now, just for context, the defense from 2023 gave up 15.6 points per game. I am going to go slightly under the 17 mark. I think that it's probably around 16 points per game. Again, we're talking about the competition that they're getting ready to play. But I think this defense is in pretty good shape. The thing that we've talked about the most, interior defensive line, that is to me the biggest question. But I think they're going to show up. I think that they're going to be up to the challenge. I think that as much as Kirby worries about the depth, that they're going to be in good shape. I think the biggest question really for me on this entire defense, when you look at it for the whole season, can that run defense get back to the level it was 2 years ago and 3 years ago. It was good last year, but it wasn't outstanding like it had been there. So I am going to say that they're under that 17. I think probably around 16 points per game is what this defense winds up allowing. Ben, where are you going? Over under 17.0 points per game allowed by this defense.
Well, I looked at just historically under Kirby. I think that there's been 3 years that they've gone over 17. And I think 2 of them were year 1 and then the COVID year. So it's rare that Kirby's smart defenses give up 17 or more points per game. I know that we've had some doubts about elements of this defense at times, but I think that that is looking at it through the UGA prism. I think that if you're looking at it through any other program in college football, you're looking at this Georgia defense, saying that there's talent across the board at every level. I think that for me, if I have any doubts about that 17 number, it probably has more to do with, I mean, you look at the schedule, Texas, you think is going to have a potent offense. Alabama, you would think will be able to at least score some points. Ole Miss typically has a good offense. You'd think Auburn will probably take a jump. Tennessee's offense, even though it hasn't had success against Georgia recently, you would think that that dam has to break at some point and that Tennessee would at least have some kind of offensive output against a Kirby Smart defense. And so I think that when you put that together, 17 comes into play, but I am going to go under. I don't think it's going to be, 10 to 12 points per game like it was, 21 and 22, but I think somewhere in that 14 to 15 range is where I see this defense being.
Ben built such a good argument to go over, and then he went under. I love it. I love adding some intrigue to this. Kipp, which way are you going? Over, under 17.0 points allowed per game?
Yeah, you just talked me both ways twice. I went back and I was thinking about it. I started one way and I'm like, okay, I mean, this is a roller coaster. But yeah, you're going to have 2 extremes this season. I think you might have like 3 shutouts this season, but then you also might have 3 or 4 shootouts. And so, I lean towards taking the over simply because I think it's going to be close, like 17-1, 17-2. But I'm also thinking about the teams. I assume we're counting postseason games in this, right? So we've done all these stat numbers. I think they're going to be playing some of these teams in the postseason and even in the SEC championship game that are just elite offenses. And it's top heavy, especially in this conference. And they're going to play the best quarterbacks in the SEC I don't want to say for sure, but on paper, they're going to play the best quarterbacks. And that is the one area where Georgia's defense, they do tend to put up a little bit more yards if you have exceptional quarterback play. And they're going to face some really, really good quarterbacks. So, yeah, I mean, 17.2 points a game is again would not be considered a successful Georgia defense under Kirby Smart, but I just think in the situations, the games they're going to have to play in the regular season and the postseason, they're going to play in like 6 or 7 top 10, top 15 teams when all is said and done, and that's going to put a lot of pressure on this defense. And I think if you can't win giving up 30 points, then you probably, didn't deserve to win anyway. I mean, I just think this team needs to be able to go out there and put up 35 plus on any team they play this season. And honestly, I think that's what they're going to have to do in these big time games.
Looking at what Kipp was just talking about, I think it's a good point to look at the playoff, because think back to that Ohio State game a couple years ago. They gave up 41 points, and that obviously would make an impression and make a mark on the overall number when you look at the end of the season. So the final over-under number, 11.5 wins for Georgia this year. And I think when you keep in mind the playoff, that obviously makes things interesting with picking that as well. So, Kipp, I'm going to start with you. Over under 11.5 wins for the Bulldogs this season.
Well, yeah, you just kind of gave me an out immediately there. Because I think Georgia goes 11-1 during the regular season. If we're just getting game by game specific, I just think like the Texas game is one where I'm like, okay, they're going to get pushed their absolute limit there. But I also think they're going to play Texas twice. And so I think that's the situation where you've seen under Kirby Smart where they've lost a regular season game, had that second opportunity to play that team. Typically, they've done fairly well against that team. And I think that's exactly what's going to happen here. And I think they go into the playoff at 11-1. Or 12-1. I don't know where that gets them as far as seeding, but I think, again, they hit that number going into the college football playoff regardless. So since you gave me the postseason to work with, then yeah, I definitely take the over on that.
Yeah, I might have added a little spice to that number had I really considered the playoff picture of it. But I think it definitely is still an interesting number because we're talking about a very difficult schedule for Georgia. So Ben, where are you going over under 11.5 wins for this Georgia team?
So where do we land on? Does the playoff count for the 11.5? Okay. Well, in that case, I am going to go over. I think that just because if you ran, 1,000 simulations of what the season would happen, like there are probably scenarios where Georgia goes 9-3 and they're out of the playoff, but there's scenarios where they go 10-3 and win a couple games in the playoff, or 10-2 and win a couple games in the playoff, or maybe even a scenario where they go 10-2 and make the SEC championship and win the SEC championship and win a playoff game. And so I do think that Georgia drops in a regular season game this season. I find it hard. I just struggle to see a scenario where Georgia goes 12-0 through the regular season 4 straight years. That seems close to impossible. I don't know if it's ever been done before or not, but if it has, I would be surprised. But I mean, I struggle to see that with the schedule that they've got. That said, I think that Georgia is in a good spot to make the playoff. And I think as long as Georgia makes the playoff, which I do concede that there are scenarios where Georgia doesn't make the playoff, but as long as Georgia makes the playoff, I think it's hard for them not to get to at least 12 wins this season.
I'm going over as well. I had Georgia going undefeated in the regular season. I think as we've gone through and gotten closer to the start of the season, I think it's a little more unrealistic. I think the 2 games that I could see them losing is at Texas, which I think Kipp mentioned, and then Alabama, just because I know that folks think that it's time to write them off with Kalen DeBoer now running the show, but I think Alabama is still going to be really dangerous. But that said, I am anticipating Georgia to make the playoff, for them to make a deep run and to have a legitimate chance to win the national championship for the 3rd time in 4 years. So I'm going over as well. I think that they'll drop a game along the way, but it's a matter of dropping the right one, winning the SEC title game, and then moving on to the playoff. All right, we're going to wrap up the episode right there. I do want to make sure and mention that Georgia will have its second scrimmage of fall camp on Saturday. Be sure to stay tuned to Dogs 24/7. We'll pass along any intel we get out of that as fall camp is slowly but surely coming to a close. So be sure to subscribe to dogs247.com. Shout out to everyone who's done that in the last few weeks. We've gotten some really good numbers and heard some great things about some of the new subscribers. We appreciate you guys so much. Also subscribe to Dogs 24/7 on YouTube. You got all these podcast episodes, Kirby Smart press conferences, player interviews, and by the time men's basketball season gets going, we'll have Mike White interviews and player interviews there as well. And also go check out Dogs 24/7 on TikTok. Got all kinds of videos from these interviews, videos from these episodes, and some stand-up stuff that we will continue throughout the season. So for Kipp Adams and Ben Wolk, I'm Jordan Hill. Until next time, take care, everybody.